So we put in our sympathetic trunk. And now we need to trace the 4 different pathways. What do you do after the sympathetic trunk is really the question. And I'm going to go through each one of these in turn. There's 4 different things that you could do. And you need to know, first of all, you know where the pre is coming from. Lateral horn goes through the anterior root and down the white ramus into the sympathetic ganglion. And then from there, you have 4 different options. And what you need to know is the actual pathway. Where does it synapse? First of all, where does the synapse occur between pre and post? And then the path of your post. And what's your target? Because each one of these pathways goes to something different. What organ are they heading to? So we'll start with number 1. The first one is spinal nerve pathway. So figure 18.7 illustrates each pathway, each of the 4 we're going to look at. So that I found that to be a really helpful figure. It's actually illustrated a few spinal cord levels. There we are, lateral horn. That's our preganglionic. And it's going to go through the anterior root into the spinal nerve. And then it's going to turn down the white ramus. And then in some cases it will synapse on the same level. And our postganglionic would start right here. So its cell body is in the sympathetic ganglion, goes back up the gray ramus, and then it heads, with the spinal nerve to a couple things. Blood vessels. So sympathetic, what does it do to blood vessels? It's actually going to constrict them. And constriction of your blood vessels, of this lumen there, that opening, constriction will raise your blood pressure. So think of a hose. Like if you have a hose of a huge diameter, really big, the flow of the liquid is not going to be very fast. But if you constrict it, like take your thumb and put it on the end of a garden hose, and it'll spray out much faster and a higher pressure. So constriction actually increases blood pressure and the speed of blood flow. And then the other major target is things in your skin. So for instance, sweat glands. Oops, almost misspelled that. It's going to make you sweat because that's what happens with sympathetic. That other weird thing, piloerection, where your hairs stand on end. So there's little muscles on the end of your hairs that'll cause goosebumps, piloerection. So those are the targets of your first spinal nerve pathway. The reason we call it spinal nerve pathway is because, and they show you a few others, so let's draw another one. Again, pre always starts lateral horn, down the anterior root, into the spinal nerve, down the white ramus. That is what happens always. This one happens to be going down a level. I don't care that you know when it goes down a level and when it doesn't. What I want you to know is spinal nerve pathway does synapse in a sympathetic ganglion. And the reason they call it spinal nerve is because this is the only pathway that goes down the gray ramus back to the spinal nerve. So the gray ramus, this is the gray, you could also call it, I guess, the gray ramus pathway. This is the only pathway, sympathetic pathway, that goes back to the spinal nerve via the gray ramus. Okay, so that's pathway number 1. Pathway number 2 has a terrible name. Its name is postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. What's annoying about it? This word, postganglionic, well, every single autonomic nervous system pathway, parasympathetic and all the sympathetics, have a postganglionic neuron. So it's not just this pathway. So I hate that name. Sorry, we're stuck with it. What makes it specific is it has the word sympathetic and nerve after it, and pathway. So it's very specifically this pathway. The better name for it, what I would think of it as, though it's not going to be on exam, but whenever you see those annoying words, think thoracic, because that's where it's going, is stuff in your thorax. That's how I think of it conceptually. So think of it thoracic instead of those 3 words. Even though you won't see them, but trigger, hopefully. If you see those 3 words, you'll think thoracic instead of that mess there. Okay, so what happens? Always. Preganglionic lateral horn. Its axons go through the anterior root into the spinal nerve and down the white ramus. So that's true of all 4 pathways. The second pathway is going to synapse on a neuron the postganglionic neuron, whose cell body is in the sympathetic ganglion, and then it does not go back up the white or gray ramus. It does not go back to the spinal nerve. Only the first pathway does that. Instead, these postganglionic neurons, they just go right out the front door. They go out anteriorly instead of heading back to the spinal nerve, and they head to their target organ. And then there you go. Target organ. Look, it's something in the thorax, the heart. Other things would be like the lungs, blood vessels around the esophagus. If you knew heart and lungs, you're good. That's fine. Your target, stuff in the thorax, heart and lungs, call it good. So what it's going to do to your heart, it's going to increase heart rate. It's going to open up your airways in your lungs so you can get lots of air in, so you have plenty of oxygen to run from the bear. So these nerves often have names. These, axons run in nerves coming out anterior out of the sympathetic trunk. One of the major ones is called the cardiac nerve going to the heart. You don't need to know that, but you do need to know that the postganglionic fibers in this pathway, the axonal fibers, just go out anteriorly and head to their target, heart and lungs. Done. Thought the other ones were confusing. I'm just going to be honest with you. The third one's a nightmare. It's the most confusing. My apologies. Always going to start in the same place, though. Cell body, lateral horn. This is the preganglionic neuron. Its axons go with the anterior root into the spinal nerve and down the white ramus. Now, in this particular pathway, the preganglionic does not synapse in the sympathetic trunk. It does not synapse on a postganglionic neuron whose cell body's sitting there. No. The preganglionic just keeps on heading out anteriorly. Much like, remember the one I just showed you here? Those are post, though, that are held postganglionic axons heading out the anterior of the sympathetic trunk. Whereas in this third pathway, it's still pre. We haven't had a synapse. This is still just one neuron, and it's going to go down, and it is going to synapse on a postganglionic neuron here, whose cell body is in some mysterious ganglion. And then the posts are going to go synapse going to go send the signal to the target organs. But let's talk about what is this mystery ganglion here. There is a set of ganglion we call the prevertebral ganglion. And I'm going to show you those in just a minute. Those are sympathetic ganglion. The other things I have to show you, let's see. Yeah, we'll start with the nerves. These, we'll get to the more complicated diagram in just a minute. These axonal fibers that come out anteriorly and head to the splanchnic, by the way, just generally means organ, but that head to, digestive system is where we're going. These things are called splanchnic nerves. There's several of them. And the target of this pathway, well, you can see intestines. I would just say abdominal or, even easier, digestive system. Digestive system organs like intestines, stomach, liver, etc., etc. That's our target. So, look at this complicated mess. Okay, so these sympathetic splanchnic nerves, keep one important thing in mind. These are not the pelvic splanchnic. Those are two totally different sets of nerves. The pelvic splanchnic nerves are, first of all, they're para. They're not sympathetic. And they are going to stuff in the pelvic cavity. Whereas our sympathetic, first of all, they're sympathetic. They're not parasympathetic. They don't have the word pelvis in front of them. They're just splanchnic or sympathetic splanchnic. And they are going to abdominal stuff. So digestive system. These guys are going to like reproductive and urinary system stuff. So unfortunately, this word is all too common in autonomics. But two different things. Okay, erase all that. So sympathetic splanchnic nerves are actually preganglionic fibers that extend out anteriorly from each of the sympathetic trunk levels. So just to back up a little bit here, here's our sympathetic trunk, and you can see these fibers heading out anteriorly, and they'll actually sometimes come together to form a splanchnic nerve. But they're still preganglionic, the first neuron in the chain. And this is a for instance, you don't have to know this. They do have names like the greater thoracic splanchnic nerve. Comes out of T5 through T9 and actually heads inferiorly to your digestive system organs. I actually have an example of that. Look at this mess. Back to this photo again. This is where we had our oops, my apologies, our white and gray rami right there that lead to the sympathetic ganglion. There's another one. So we have all these sympathetic trunk ganglion. And then you can see this coming out. Oh my God, coming out of the sympathetic trunk ganglion. You can see these coming together. Those are some splanchnic nerves. They're coming out from the sympathetic trunk, and they're still preganglionic fibers. And they come together to form things like the greater thoracic splanchnic nerve. Don't care that you know those specifics. Just know that preganglionic fibers in this pathway become splanchnic nerves. That's what we call them after they leave the sympathetic trunk. Then, eventually, they travel along and reach what we call prevertebral ganglia. There's these yellow things. They have cell bodies of your postganglionic in them. Facts about the preganglionic. First of all, they are not paired. I don't know if you remember what that means because we haven't talked about these terms in a while. I did at the very beginning of the term. If some organ is paired, that means you have a left and a right, like your eyeballs and your kidneys and your lungs. Not paired would mean you have a single one or single set, like your heart. In the case of I say set, because prevertebral ganglia, actually there's a few going along, really anteriorly to this big red organ. I made a mess. Okay, this big red tube structure, that is, oops. So the prevertebral, not paired, they are anterior to the vertebral column. That's why we call them the prevertebral, but really they are directly anterior to this big red tube here. That is the abdominal aorta. So actually the aorta comes out, like if it, I'm just gonna try, terrible. This is your heart, and then the big fat aorta comes out of it and then heads down inferiorly into your abdomen. And this giant red blood vessel is where that you'll find the prevertebral ganglia. They're really sitting, I wouldn't say on top of it, they're sitting anteriorly, but they're kind of stuck on there like this onto that abdominal aorta, those little ganglia. So those are the prevertebral. They should call it the preaortic or something. I don't know, but that's where they are. So this prevertebral ganglia would be sitting just anterior to the abdominal aorta, and then the postganglionic fibers would come out and synapse onto your digestive system organs. Yeah, so this one's really confusing because you had to add these two extra things. You had to add these splanchnic nerves, which are preganglionic coming out of the sympathetic trunk. And then you also had to add these annoying things, the prevertebral ganglia sitting here. And coming out of those ganglia would be postganglionic fibers that would, well, the organs are now gone. The intestines are not visible here, but they would head out straight to the intestines that would be sitting anterior to these vessels and the kidneys.